The meeting began without ceremony, with tension settling instantly as papers moved across the table, and no one spoke. My name is Cynthia Blake. I was in my mid-30s at the time, sitting quietly as the inheritance meeting officially began. We had gathered to divide what my parents left behind, yet the conversation never felt shared. From the moment my older sister walked in with a lawyer at her side, the tone shifted. She did not ask questions or look for reactions. She moved straight to conclusions, speaking with a certainty that left little room for disagreement. "This is straightforward," she said, as she placed a folder on the table. "The house belongs to me." No one interrupted her. The lawyer began reading the document, his voice even and controlled as he worked through the primary clauses related to ownership, authority, and final decisions. Each line sounded deliberate, delivered with the confidence of someone expecting the discussion to end before it truly began. I watched how she leaned back in her chair, how her gaze swept across the room, and how the papers were used to assert control rather than invite explanation. Instead of responding or asking for clarification, I stayed where I was and followed the way the meeting was being guided, paying closer attention to the structure of the exchange than to the words themselves. When the lawyer reached the final section, his pace slowed. He turned the page and paused longer than necessary, his grip tightening around the file, allowing the silence to stretch in a way that felt intentional. "What's wrong?" my sister asked sharply. "Read it." He hesitated. She leaned forward, impatience cutting through her earlier composure as her voice rose. "That's what you're paid for. Read it." Something in that pause altered the atmosphere of the room, even though nothing had been explained yet. If you want to understand why that moment mattered and what followed after the meeting continued, stay with me. The reason comes later, and it changes how this story ends. Before we go any further, drop a comment with the time you're watching and your city. It helps me understand how far this story has reached. The call came late at night, just as I was sitting at the kitchen table trying to finish small tasks that suddenly felt harder than they should have. My phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number, and the voice on the other end spoke carefully, choosing each word in a way that immediately signaled this was not a routine call. "I'm sorry to have to tell you this." The man said, his tone steady but restrained. "Your parents were involved in a traffic accident earlier this evening." The rest of the explanation reached me in fragments rather than as a complete picture. I asked the same question more than once without realizing it, then struggled to follow the instructions about where I needed to go and who would be waiting for me. Simple decisions that normally required no effort, like what to bring or which number to call next, felt strangely out of reach, and I remained at the table long after the call ended, staring at my phone while trying to understand what had just changed. By the time I arrived at the hospital, everything had already been confirmed through paperwork and brief conversations. My mother and my father were gone, with no opportunity left for questions, explanations, or final words that might have eased the shock. A nurse stood beside me and said quietly, "We did everything we could," before guiding me through forms that required signatures I barely remembered writing. The days that followed moved forward whether I was ready or not. The funeral was arranged quickly, surrounded by relatives and familiar faces who tried to help without knowing how. Conversations focused on schedules, logistics, and arrangements, while I struggled to stay attentive long enough to follow what was being said. Grief did not arrive as dramatic emotion, but as an inability to concentrate on ordinary responsibilities that used to feel automatic. During that period, my older sister Teresa stepped into a role that quickly became visible to everyone else. She contacted the funeral home, returned calls that kept coming in, and spoke with people who asked questions I could not yet process. When she saw me hesitate while holding the phone, she took it from my hand and said, "I'll take care of this for now. You don't need to deal with it." From the outside, her actions appeared responsible and necessary, and at that moment I accepted them that way. I did not have the energy to question anything, and seeing someone else manage the details felt like relief rather than intrusion. When a relative asked about paperwork later that afternoon, Teresa answered calmly, "We're handling things step by step. There's no rush." While arrangements were still being finalized, I noticed how difficult it was to focus even on small decisions. Choosing clothing, responding to messages, or signing basic documents required more concentration than I could manage, and I often asked people to repeat information they had just given me. Grief showed itself through disconnection rather than tears, leaving me physically present but mentally elsewhere. At that stage, thoughts about money or inheritance did not enter my mind. My priority was getting through each day without making a decision I would regret later, even though I had no idea what those regrets might eventually look like. When Teresa mentioned that she had contacted a lawyer to help organize documents, she framed it as a practical necessity rather than a financial matter. "It's just to keep things in order," she said, and I nodded without asking questions. As the funeral ended and people returned to their routines, the structure around us shifted. Fewer visitors stopped by, fewer calls checked in, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the activity that came before. Teresa continued managing follow-up tasks related to paperwork and correspondence, while I focused on adjusting to the absence that now shaped my daily life. By the end of that week, the family had moved out of the initial shock into a quieter phase, where responsibilities still demanded attention, even though the emotional weight had not lifted. Nothing had been discussed openly yet, but decisions were beginning to take form beneath the surface, and the roles within the family were already settling into patterns that would matter later. 2 weeks after the funeral, daily life still felt unsettled. Yet the tasks that needed to be handled continued to surface whether anyone felt ready or not. Family members began meeting more often, usually to talk through paperwork schedules and follow-up calls. The conversations were quieter than before, but they were not comfortable, and nothing about them felt temporary. Teresa started keeping all the paperwork related to the house and other matters in one place, explaining that it would be faster if one person handled the documents instead of passing them around. She collected property records, correspondence from institutions' account statements, and copies of certificates into a thick binder that stayed with her whenever the family met. When I asked where a specific document was, she answered immediately, "I have it." Keeping everything together avoids unnecessary issues. Over time, all communication with the lawyer began to run through Teresa. Calls were scheduled around her availability, messages were returned only after she reviewed them, and questions from relatives were often answered before anyone else had a chance to speak. When someone asked whether a document needed to be signed right away, Teresa responded without hesitation, "There's no need to worry, that part has already been handled." The exchange ended there with no follow-up discussion. Whenever procedures came up, Teresa redirected the conversation toward finishing quickly. She said delays only created more complications and insisted that closing matters sooner would benefit everyone involved. During one discussion, she tapped the edge of the binder and said, "The sooner this is done, the easier it will be for all of us." The statement sounded reasonable, but hearing it repeated so often began to stand out. Even conversations that did not start with paperwork tended to drift back to timelines and completion. When the lawyer mentioned that there might be a few options worth reviewing, Teresa cut in and said, "We don't need to go through everything again. Let's just move forward." The topic shifted immediately, and no one challenged her. Other family members appeared to choose distance rather than engagement. Some avoided eye contact when Teresa spoke, others nodded briefly, and a few left meetings earlier than expected. No one openly agreed or disagreed, but the lack of response made it easier for Teresa to continue directing everything without resistance. I began paying closer attention to small details that might have gone unnoticed earlier. I noticed who decided meeting times, who spoke first during calls, and how quickly certain topics were closed. I did not interrupt or question those moments, partly because I had no concrete reason to object, and partly because I wanted to be sure of what I was seeing. At one point, I asked about a document I had not been shown. Teresa looked at me and said, It's just standard paperwork. There's nothing there you need to review. Her tone was calm, not defensive, but it left no opening for further conversation. I nodded and let the matter drop, aware that pressing the issue would change the atmosphere in a way I was not prepared to handle. The meetings continued in much the same way. Tasks were completed, calls were made, and information flowed through a single channel. I remained present, listening more than speaking, noting how decisions were framed as settled before they were openly discussed. I did not seek confirmation elsewhere or raise concerns at that stage. Instead, I focused on remembering what was said, how it was said, and when discussions ended sooner than expected. Nothing had been decided in front of me yet, but patterns were forming. I stayed observant, collecting details quietly, understanding that reacting too early would reveal more about my position than about the situation itself. About a month later, routine errands slowly filled the empty spaces left by grief, and one afternoon led me into an unexpected conversation that stayed with me long after it ended. I ran into Margaret Lewis, a longtime family acquaintance I had not seen in years, while waiting in line during an ordinary stop that had nothing to do with legal matters or family discussions. The setting was casual enough that neither of us lowered our voices, and the exchange felt unplanned rather than deliberate. Margaret recognized me first and asked how I had been managing. Her tone was steady and respectful, without the careful sympathy most people used when mentioning my parents. We spoke briefly about practical things, work schedules, and how quickly time had moved since the funeral. She listened more than she spoke, watching my reactions, rather than pressing for details. After a short pause, she leaned slightly closer and said, "I will not take much of your time, but I want to say something you should remember." I nodded without responding, unsure where the conversation was heading. Margaret continued, "Be careful with any documents you are asked to sign, even if they seem routine." Her voice did not carry urgency, but it carried certainty. When I asked what she meant, she shook her head lightly and replied, "I am not here to explain situations or point fingers. I am only telling you to read everything yourself." The warning was brief, yet it shifted the way I listened to everything that followed. Margaret did not offer examples or stories, and she did not mention my sister or any recent family matters. Instead, she added one more sentence delivered calmly and without emphasis. "Once something is signed, fixing it later becomes much harder." After that, she changed the subject and asked whether I was planning to stay in town much longer. We parted shortly after, and I did not tell Teresa about the encounter. I did not mention Margaret's name during family calls, nor did I bring up the advice with anyone else. There was no argument to have, no accusation to make, and no immediate action to justify. Still, the conversation followed me through the rest of the day, replaying itself during quiet moments. I began reviewing the situation differently, not by looking for dramatic signs, but by noticing what had already become familiar. Teresa continued handling all correspondence and remained the point of contact for anything related to paperwork. Meetings moved quickly, and documents were often summarized rather than shared. Nothing openly improper occurred, yet the pace left little room for independent review. That night, I pulled out the few copies of records I had access to and read them carefully, paying attention to language rather than conclusions. I made notes for myself, marking terms I did not fully understand and sections that referenced additional documents I had not seen. This process did not feel confrontational, but it felt necessary. I also looked up basic information about estate procedures on my own, focusing on general steps rather than specific outcomes. I did not contact a lawyer or seek advice at that point. Instead, I wanted to understand the framework well enough to recognize when something fell outside it. Margaret's warning had not given me answers, but it had shifted my position. I was no longer waiting to be informed. I was paying attention with purpose, aware that clarity would not arrive on its own. The responsibility to understand what lay ahead had quietly moved into my hands, and I was prepared to carry it without announcing that change to anyone else. 1 week later, a quiet sense of urgency settled in, not driven by fear but by the need to understand what had already been set in motion. I began accessing older records related to the house and other assets through formal channels that were available to me as a beneficiary, making sure every request followed standard procedure and did not involve Teresa. I did not announce what I was doing or hint at it during family calls because drawing attention too early would only narrow my access and change how information reached me. The first set of documents came from the county archive routine property records that showed the house as it had existed on paper for years. I compared them line by line with copies Teresa had circulated after the funeral, focusing on appendices rather than summaries. At first glance, the changes seemed minor, mostly formatting and updated references, yet the dates attached to certain revisions stood out. A few amendments had been filed after the funeral, which in itself was not illegal, but the timing raised questions that had not been addressed in any family discussion. I contacted a clerk to clarify procedural details, keeping my questions neutral and specific. I'm looking to confirm when these addendums were submitted and whether earlier versions are still on file, I said, choosing my words carefully. The clerk responded without hesitation, explaining the standard process and adding, if there was a previous version, it should be archived unless it was formally withdrawn. That confirmation gave me a clearer path forward without revealing my intent. As I reviewed the archived files, a clause emerged that had never been mentioned in conversations led by Teresa. It outlined conditions under which ownership could be reassigned if certain steps were completed within a defined period following a death. The language was precise, not hidden yet easy to overlook if one relied solely on verbal explanations. I read it several times, not to jump to conclusions, but to understand exactly how it functioned within the broader document. I reached out to an independent records office to verify consistency between versions, presenting myself simply as someone cross-checking paperwork. I'm not disputing anything I said during the call. I just need to confirm that this clause appears unchanged across all filings. The response was measured. From what I see, the clause itself is original, but its application depends on how subsequent documents reference it. That distinction mattered more than I expected. Near the end of the week, I requested one final confirmation, this time regarding notice requirements tied to that overlooked clause. Does this require acknowledgement from all beneficiaries, or can it proceed without explicit consent? I asked. The reply came after a pause. Consent is implied only if certain notices are properly documented. The representative said, careful not to offer opinion. That sentence alone justified the time I had spent digging. That evening, I closed the file with no intention of confronting anyone yet. What I had gathered was not an accusation or a defense, but preparation. I understood now that the upcoming meeting would not be about persuasion or emotion. It would be about timing, documentation, and who entered the room fully informed. The day before the meeting, the confidence Teresa had been carrying quietly for weeks became something she displayed openly in front of everyone else. She spoke on group calls as if the outcome had already been recorded somewhere official, referring to the meeting in the past tense, rather than as something that had yet to happen. When relatives asked procedural questions, she answered quickly, framing every response as a settled matter rather than an issue still under review. There's really nothing left to decide, she said, during one call, her tone measured but firm. Tomorrow is just a formality, so everything can move forward. Her comments shifted subtly when the focus turned toward me. She did not mention my name directly at first, choosing instead to speak in general terms that made the message clear without confrontation. Some people don't like paperwork, she said, pausing long enough for the implication to settle. That's why it helps to have someone who understands how these things work. The distance she created through language felt intentional, reinforcing a hierarchy she assumed everyone else accepted. Later that afternoon, a message arrived from her lawyer marked as reference material for the meeting. The subject line suggested routine preparation, but the attachments told a more specific story. The documents summarized anticipated outcomes, outlining ownership transitions as expected conclusions rather than possibilities. There was no request for feedback, only an assumption of alignment. I read through each page, carefully comparing them to the records I had already reviewed on my own. The alignment was precise. Every clause I had flagged earlier appeared exactly as I remembered, though the emphasis had been rearranged to direct attention away from key conditions. The omission was not accidental. It required a reader to rely on explanation instead of verification. I recognized the strategy immediately, not because it was clever, but because it depended on everyone else moving quickly. Teresa called later that evening, her voice calm and almost cordial. "I just wanted to make sure you saw the materials," she said, as if offering assistance rather than oversight. When I confirmed that I had received them, she continued, "It should make tomorrow easier for you. There won't be much to go over." I responded without adding detail, keeping my words limited to confirming my attendance. There was no benefit in correcting her assumptions or challenging her narrative before the meeting itself. After the call ended, I went back to the documents one final time, not to search for new information, but to confirm consistency. The language held. The timelines matched. The condition Teresa never mentioned remained embedded exactly where it should be. I organized my copies, carefully placing them in the order they would naturally be read, rather than the order she had presented. Preparation at this stage meant clarity, not confrontation. Another message arrived shortly before nightfall, this one addressed to the family as a whole. Teresa wrote that she would arrive early to help streamline the discussion, adding, "Let's keep emotions out of it so we can finish quickly." The phrasing sounded reasonable on the surface, yet it positioned any disagreement as unnecessary disruption rather than legitimate concern. I read it once, then set my phone aside without responding. As the evening settled, I considered whether silence might be mistaken for uncertainty. It was possible, but the alternative would have introduced questions I did not need answered yet. The meeting was scheduled, the documents were finalized. Every assumption Teresa was making depended on one thing she could not control, which was how closely the material would be read once it was presented in full. I confirmed my calendar, set out the files I intended to bring, then closed everything down for the night. There was no benefit in rehearsing conversations that might never happen. The only thing that mattered was showing up prepared, without reacting to the pressure Teresa had been applying so confidently. The tension did not come from fear of what might be said tomorrow, but from knowing exactly when it would be said and by whom. That morning, the meeting settled into a quiet rhythm that felt rehearsed, with everyone seated and the documents arranged as if nothing unexpected could still surface. The lawyer began reading through the file in order, moving steadily from preliminary language into the ownership provisions. His tone stayed neutral and precise, the kind used when every word carries legal weight. Teresa followed along closely, occasionally nodding when sections aligned with what she had already told the family. When he referenced prior filings, she leaned back, slightly confident enough to let the process speak for her. As the reading continued, the room relaxed. A few relatives glanced at their phones or shifted in their chairs, assuming the remaining pages were procedural. Then the lawyer reached the final page. He stopped. Not abruptly, but long enough for the silence to register as deliberate rather than accidental. His eyes stayed on the text and his hand rested flat against the paper, as if grounding himself before continuing. Teresa noticed immediately. "Why did you stop?" she asked. "You can keep reading." The lawyer hesitated. "This section requires attention," he said carefully, still not lifting his eyes. "There's nothing new there," Teresa replied. "Read it." When he did not resume, her patience snapped. "This is wasting time," she said. "We already know the outcome. Read the last clause." The lawyer closed the folder halfway, then looked up. "I cannot summarize this without addressing the conditions attached," he said. That was enough for Teresa to reach across the table, pull the folder toward herself and open it wide. "I'll read it," she said. She scanned the paragraph quickly at first, then slowed. The clause was written plainly without emphasis, but its meaning was specific. It stated that the family home could be transferred into sole ownership only if one beneficiary could document continuous residency at the property for the required period, along with verified responsibility for property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs during that same time. Failing that, the property remained under shared ownership with no individual holding exclusive claim or authority. Teresa read the sentence again, this time aloud, stopping at the phrases "documented residency" and "verified financial responsibility." Her voice tightened. "This doesn't apply to me," she said, looking up. "I handled the paperwork." The lawyer shook his head slightly. "The clause applies to anyone claiming sole ownership," he said. "It becomes effective only when supporting documentation is formally filed. Those materials were not included in the packet you submitted." I placed my folder on the table, then sliding it forward without speaking at first. Inside were copies of property tax receipts issued in my name, continuous homeowners insurance policies, and a certified residency verification from the county office, all covering the exact period specified in the clause. The dates were clear. The filings were complete. "I filed these with the county before the deadline," I said, keeping my voice even. "They confirm that I met every condition listed in the final clause." The lawyer opened my folder and reviewed the documents, carefully matching them against the language he had just read. He checked the dates, the official stamps, and the signatures. No questions were needed. When he looked up again, the shift in the room was unmistakable. "With these records," he said, turning to Teresa, "the clause is triggered. Sole ownership cannot be transferred to any party who does not meet the residency and financial responsibility requirements. Based on the documentation provided, those conditions were satisfied by her." Teresa stared at the table. "You went behind my back," she said quietly. "I followed the terms as written," I replied. "The clause does not require notice." No one interrupted after that. There was nothing left to argue. The outcome was no longer a matter of confidence or preparation, but of compliance. Teresa closed the folder in front of her slower this time, as if hoping the text might change once it was no longer visible. The lawyer suggested a pause to outline next steps, but the direction of the meeting had already shifted. I remained silent. My role finished the moment the documents were verified. Authority in the room no longer came from who spoke most confidently, but from what had been proven, and the silence that followed belonged to the person who had assumed the least would be questioned. Months later, the consequences settled into place in ways that could not be reversed or explained away. Teresa did not face anything dramatic or theatrical, but the shift in her position was unmistakable. The legal record now reflected what had happened at the meeting, which meant she no longer had authority over the house or any related decisions. Her lawyer stopped returning her calls within weeks, citing a completed mandate and unresolved conflicts of interest. Extended family members who once deferred to her opinions became distant, choosing shorter conversations or avoiding discussions altogether when her name came up. Invitations slowed, then stopped. Not because anyone announced a rift, but because her influence had quietly dissolved. Within the family, the adjustment was uneven. Some relatives attempted to reopen contact with me through neutral messages or practical questions, hoping to restore a version of normal that no longer existed. I did not engage in arguments or explanations. I answered only what was necessary, and when conversations drifted toward reconciliation or emotional appeals, I let them end naturally. Silence became a boundary rather than a reaction. Over time, that boundary was understood even if it was not welcomed. My own life shifted through deliberate choices that had nothing to do with proving a point. I formalized ownership matters, updated my financial plans, and separated my personal records from anything connected to the family estate. I changed how I handled communication, keeping everything documented and professional, even when dealing with people I once trusted. Decisions that used to feel heavy became routine once they were guided by clarity rather than obligation. I did not look for closure from Teresa, nor did I wait for an apology. What happened did not require emotional resolution to be valid. The outcome stood on documented facts and lawful process, and that was enough. Cutting contact was not done in anger or disappointment. It was a calculated step taken after understanding that continued access would only reopen space for manipulation. Distance became a tool for stability, not a punishment. Over time, the family adapted to the reality that I was no longer available in the way I once had been. There were no dramatic confrontations or final conversations. The separation was defined by consistency. Calls were not returned. Messages went unanswered. Events were skipped. Eventually, expectations adjusted. For anyone listening to this story, there is a lesson worth holding on to. Family ties do not replace written agreements, and trust should never exist without verification when legal matters are involved. Boundaries are not betrayals, they are safeguards. Understanding what you sign, what you inherit, and what conditions apply is not distrustful. It is responsible. Silence preparation and documentation often protect you more effectively than confrontation ever could. Thank you for staying with this story through every part of it. If you have faced a situation where family pressure and legal responsibility collided, your experience matters. Share your thoughts or your perspective in the comments. Let me know how you would have handled a moment like this and what lessons you believe are most important to take forward.